So one of the central pieces of sort of theory that we're going to be working with in this class comes from an essay and then later a book by Graham Allison, in which he lays out three conceptual models or three ways of thinking about state behavior. And I'd like to run through each of those three conceptual models here in this presentation. The first one, which we've kind of talked a little bit about already, is the unitary actor model. And this is sort of what we've been talking about when we've been talking about rationality and some of the assumptions of rationality that oftentimes get sort of made in discussions of foreign policy. And the idea is that we can think about state policy as like a coherent thing, that the decision making behind that policy is going to be rational, right? It's going to have been thought through. It's going to consider all the options. It's going to be value maximizing, right? You're picking the best option, and it's going to be unitary. So once a policy has been chosen, the entire state is going to act in a coherent way to carry that policy out, so that we can sort of talk about state behavior as a single conscious national choice, right? That states are trying to advance their national interest and that they're carrying out policy in a way that will do what they intend to do. And this is really a problematic model. It's widely used, it's sort of simple, and social scientists do like models that are sort of simple and help us understand the world. But this runs into some real problems that Allison sort of highlights and tries to get around with his other two models. One of those is that it sort of anthropomorphizes a state, right? It assumes that states have a single mind when they don't, when there's many different power centers, when there's tremendous disagreement, when there's not sort of a coherent vision for foreign policy that's universally shared within a state, right? It assumes that states are able to act with a singular purpose when, again, that's not the case. There's many different actors who have their own interests, who are pursuing their own goals. States are, in fact, these complex organizations, and we can miss a lot by undertaking this process of treating states as though they're humans, as though they're actors that are unified and coherent. Again, it sort of assumes that there's that single national interest. When we talked about rationality, there's that idea that I have my own preference ordering and I can select the best policy because I can figure out which policy gives me the best utility. But if there's not a single coherent mind and there's not agreement on what that national interest is, it's really hard to see how the choices that states make are going to really be value maximizing in terms of achieving the national interest. And therefore, we sort of can find ourselves walking into sort of this tautological mistake where we assume that states are rational, we assume that they're making the best choice, but in fact, they're making choices that reflect a whole bunch of other stuff. And we've just sort of told ourselves that that's actually the best decision a state could make because we're sort of bound in by this assumption that states are being rational. And so Allison tries to sort of give us other ways of thinking about state behavior that allow us to sort of set aside that unitary rational model, which isn't to say it's completely useless. There's still lots of situations where we want to talk about Germany did this or Spain did that. But when we're thinking about state behavior, we don't want to fall into all those traps. And so one way that we can sort of step back from that sort of rational unitary actor assumption is by thinking about states through the organizational politics model. And this model says that rather than thinking about a single national decision, we should assume that states are these loosely aligned organizations. So we've got a State Department and a Defense Department and a Treasury Department, and they're loosely aligned and they're kind of working together, but they're kind of their own thing. And they're making decisions and taking actions, and we shouldn't assume that there's sort of coherence across these organizations, because each organization is going to be making decisions that are self-interested and parochial. They're doing what's best for their organization, and it might not actually serve the interests of other organizations, and it might not actually serve the interests of the United States as a whole, because people are thinking about their own organization. And so one common example of this is limited information sharing, that the CIA and the FBI rarely share information with each other because the FBI is interested in building court cases and sending people to prison, and that means presenting evidence in a court of law. And the CIA is interested in collecting secret information and protecting sources, and that means not putting that information in a court of law. And so the CIA will actively withhold information from the FBI to protect its sources, to serve its interests, even when the FBI is working on, prosecuting terrorists or war criminals, and having that information would be useful to serve this other interests. Organizations will seek policy and take actions that will benefit members of their organization. They're thinking about how to make their organization successful, and they're not necessarily thinking about the big picture. On top of that, we sort of reinforce this problem with the way that policies get sort of carried out, that oftentimes leaders will say, I want to, let's say, sanction Russia in some way for seizing territory in Crimea or hacking US government networks. And that task of sanctioning Russia gets handed to the State Department, which is responsible for the diplomatic side of things. But it's also handed to the Treasury Department, which is responsible for the financial side of things. And the decisions that are made and how those get carried out may not actually communicate with each other. They may not be consistent. They may make different decisions in how that gets actually implemented. We shouldn't assume that there's a single decision because policies end up getting doled out to different organizations. So again, with that organizational politics model, we don't have to assume that because a state took an action that reflects a coherent national decision, right? It could be a particular faction of that state, of that organization, bureaucratic apparatus made that decision, but it doesn't necessarily mean that was somebody chose to do that representing the country. And people take actions within these organizations that will get them promoted within the organization. So again, just reinforcing this idea that we're not really thinking about the big picture. My favorite example of this relates to intelligence, the intelligence community. And so if you are a CIA analyst, one of the things that will make you an effective CIA analyst is building up language skills, learning the history and culture of the region that you're studying, meeting the people who are the decision makers in that country. Those kind of things take years to build that kind of level of expertise. And so if I was trying to design a system to get the best analysis I could from my analysts, I would want to encourage people to stay and study and become experts in a region or in a country. But the way that the government bureaucracy is set up, after a couple of years working in that job as an analyst, you kind of max out at your pay grade and you can't get any additional raises. And the way to, get enough money to get a house or send your children to, a nice preschool is to move into management. But management doesn't want people who've spent their entire careers working in sort of one narrow part of the organization. Management wants people who've done some time as an analyst, who've done some times working in operations, maybe have served overseas. They want people who've been in the HR division, maybe people who understand the technology side of the CIA. They want people with all these different experiences so that they can be good general managers that can be slotted into overseeing different parts of the organization. And that creates an incentive for workers to not get really, really good at their job, but instead to maneuver through the organization for the hope of getting that promotion, right? So people are responding to the incentives of that organization, and the incentives may not produce the kind of outcomes that we want to see or that we might desire. In addition, organizations try to manage through standard operating procedures, right? Bureaucracies create rules for how to do things. And the Department of Defense is sort of famous for this, that there's all of these different war plans and all these different, military manuals and handbooks that tell you how to do everything. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is sort of the case study that Allison uses when he's developing these models, he notes that when the Kennedy administration orders a blockade of Cuba, the Navy simply pulls down the handbook that tells them how to set up a blockade. And that handbook says set up the blockade far enough out from Cuba that you're outside the range of, fighter jets that might be able to attack ships. Well, that's great in terms of a blockade, but Kennedy's goal with the blockade wasn't to effectively lock Cuba away. His goal with the blockade was to put pressure on the Soviet Union. And setting up the blockade in that way essentially meant that the United States was going to encounter Soviet ships really fast. And there wouldn't be that sort of diplomatic time for the Soviet Union to adjust. It essentially accelerated a crisis when that wasn't Kennedy's intent. But again, organizations don't sort of know the mind of the president. People within organizations follow the rules that the organizations have set up. And I think that when we think about state actions, it's worth keeping in mind that states just do certain things certain ways out of habit, routine, and rules. And then lastly, it's worth recognizing that organizations learn and adapt slowly, that it oftentimes takes a crisis or a cataclysmic failure or an injection of resources or a budget cut will do it too, I guess, to force organizations to break from what they have been doing, to sort of step back, to reprioritize, to think creatively about how to carry out their mission in a different way. That doesn't just happen naturally. Organizations just sort of stumble forward. And all of these things that Allison points to really, hammer home that idea that state behavior shouldn't be just assumed to be planned. That state behavior, the actions that states take, is the sum of many different parts. And again, this is a useful framework to have in the back of our minds so that we don't fall into the trap of seeing the actions of another state and assuming that there was a conscious decision behind it, because there isn't always a conscious decision behind what states do. The third model that Allison sort of highlights is the bureaucratic politics model. And I've always found this to be kind of confusing because the previous model, the organizational politics model, is talking about how bureaucracies operate. But the bureaucratic politics model is actually talking about how the heads of bureaucracies operate. And so I think I actually approve of one of the sort of tweaks that's made in our textbook by Hastett. Hastett talks about this as the elite politics model. Because we're talking about the folks who are running powerful organizations and how they're contesting with each other for influence over policy. And so Allison sort of talks about this bureaucratic or elite politics model as powerful individuals sort of playing a tug of war game over policy and outcomes. And that, again, we're not thinking about policy as a single coherent mind making a decision. We're thinking about multiple self-interested individuals who are essentially wrestling over what policy should be. And that it's not necessarily going to be a single decision. It's not necessarily going to be a coherent decision, and it's not necessarily going to reflect a systematic process. It's going to reflect the group dynamics of those individuals involved. And Allison sort of takes that insight and observation and again sort of parlays it out into some additional insights into thinking about policymaking. And so he's very famous for this expression of where you sit determines where you stand, right? That the position that you take on any particular policy issue is really related to what your job is, right? And that if you are in the chair as Secretary of Defense, you're going to be thinking through that problem from the perspective of the Secretary of Defense, and that's going to affect what you advocate for. You're going to advocate for things that you think will benefit your organization, that your organization can do well. If there's a problem you don't want to be stuck with, right, you try to shunt that over and make the State Department deal with it because you're defending your organization's interests. And again, that's very different than thinking about policy as what's in the national interest and trying to sort of sort out what's the best solution for the country. Another insight Allison sort of draws from this is that folks who are running organizations are really busy, right? They've got a lot of different demands. And so when they're making decisions, they don't have time to go through that whole rational process of thinking through solutions, considering pros and cons, and weighing all the benefits. They're in a satisficing mode, right? They're looking for the first solution that can solve that problem. They've got an hour for this meeting, and at the end of that hour, the problem has to be solved. They have to have a decision to move things forward. And so, again, we shouldn't assume that things are being thought through. We should assume that the can is being sort of kicked down the road as leaders try to, wrap up this meeting and move to the next one. And as a result of that, policy isn't a well thought out plan. It's a series of these quick decisions made in meetings that collectively accumulate up to a national policy. And again, this is a different way of thinking about policy, where we don't make the assumption of rationality, we don't make the assumption of planning, we make the assumption that there are parochial, self-interested actors who are doing war with each other, bureaucratic war, and doing that under real constraints of time and information, and motivation.